Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take those topics you're curious about, look at the sources you send us, and, well, we pull out the key stuff.
Yeah, the goal is really to make complicated things clearer, give you those aha moments.
Exactly. And today, we are diving into something that's caused quite a stir online. The whole Yasuke controversy around the Assassin's Creed game.
Right, and we've got some interesting material, including a YouTube discussion with Japanese art and history researchers, plus some other commentators chiming in.
So for you, the learner listening in, our aim here is to give you a clear map of this whole situation. It can get pretty confusing online.
Definitely. We want to cut through that noise, highlight what really matters, save you some time, basically. Think of us as your guides through all this info.
We'll be connecting the dots between different viewpoints.
And we'll be drawing on insights from folks like Haruki Shoko, she's a Japanese art researcher.
And Gozaichi, a Japanese history researcher. They host the Haruki de Gozamasu YouTube channel.
Plus, contributions from Mr. Bushido, a history YouTuber, and Shikakaku, who focuses on Sengoku history and also has a science background.
Yeah, it's clear this topic hit a nerve. I mean, Gozaichi's first video on it blew up.
It really did. They even did an emergency broadcast on their channel after hitting a subscriber milestone because the discussion was so intense.
The number of comments alone tells you something. People are really engaged or maybe agitated by this?
For sure. Okay, so let's dig into those initial reactions first. The online discussion itself.
Right. Mr. Bushido, you mentioned him. He made a video about Yasuke because his viewers wanted it, correct?
That's right. And the response was, well, pretty overwhelming. He mentioned getting around 770 comments.
Wow. Compared to his usual.
Usually around 100 for videos on historical drama, so a huge spike.
But here's the twist, right? The viewership wasn't actually higher.
No, it was lower than usual, which is interesting. It suggests a lot of people were commenting without really watching the full video.
Reacting maybe just to the title or seeing stuff elsewhere.
Exactly. Mr. Bushido kind of described it as feeling like a bulletin board, people just dropping comments without engaging with the actual arguments he was making.
And it wasn't just people not watching. There was also, like, deliberate misinformation.
Yeah, he mentioned seeing edited clips, sort of misleading snippets being shared on X.
Ah, Twitter, yeah.
Right, and that just fanned the flames, created more misunderstanding about what he was actually saying. He sounded pretty frustrated, that people weren't grappling with his points before commenting.
It sounds tough. Now, on a slightly lighter note, Shikaku had that spelling incident.
Oh, yeah, a slight chuckle. He apparently misspelled Assassin's Creed as Ashen Creed.
Ashen Creed.
Yeah, which he joked sounded like some kind of greedy creed. The internet, of course, jumped on it immediately. Lots of comments pointing it out.
You got to be careful online. But he owned up to it.
Totally. Apologized, corrected it. It just shows how fast things get picked up and amplified, I guess.
Okay, so let's get to the core of what Mr. Bushido was trying to argue in his video. It's centered on Thomas Lockley's book, right? Nobunaga and Yasuke.
Yes, and the English version, African Samurai. The main thing he wanted to tackle was this claim going around online.
Which claim was that?
The idea that Lockley's book stated there was a widespread black slave trade in Japan. This was causing a lot of anger.
Okay, so Mr. Bushido actually read the book, both versions.
He did, Japanese and English. And his finding, he couldn't find any explicit statement about a black slave trade in Japan.
So the claim was just wrong.
Well, he suggested maybe some passages could be misinterpreted that way if you squinted, perhaps, but no direct assertion of it. He felt a lot of the online anger was based on this inaccurate premise about the book's content.
That really highlights the danger of misinformation spreading online.
Definitely. And his reasoning was interesting, too. He figured if Lockley really wanted to push that idea, wouldn't he have put it clearly in the English version for a wider audience?
Makes sense. The fact that it wasn't in either version suggested to Mr. Bushido that wasn't Lockley's actual point.
Right. But even when he presented this, based on the text itself, people still pushed back hard in the comments.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, some just insisted the book did say it, often without, pointing to where they seem to be relying on maybe summaries they'd read or what other YouTubers said.
Instead of the source material itself.
Exactly. Others would just change the subject entirely. They'd start arguing about whether Yasuke was really a samurai or just criticizing Assassin's Creed in general.
Avoiding the specific point he was making about the book.
Right. And it got personal, too. He mentioned being called names like a white person's dog just for suggesting people should, buy the book and check for themselves.
Wow. That's pretty extreme.
Yeah, and people demanding he reply to every single comment, even the really aggressive ones. There was this sense from some commenters that, like, facts didn't matter, it was all emotion and attacking anyone who disagreed. Some even said rational debate was pointless against these extreme views.
It sounds incredibly draining.
Hmm.
But he committed to keep trying to have the conversation.
He did, yeah. Showed a lot of persistence there.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Let's bring in Shikaku's perspective. He offered a different angle, looking at cultural appropriation and historical revisionism, particularly how those ideas play out in the West.
Yeah, this adds another important layer. Shikaku started by explaining the typical Western understanding of cultural appropriation.
Like the dynamic between majority and minority cultures.
Exactly. He used examples like criticism of people holding kimono try-on events in Boston, or when Karlie Kloss wore geisha-style clothing in a photo shoot. In some Western circles, those things are seen as insensitive, potentially racist, because they might trivialize or misuse elements from a culture with less historical power.
Okay, so that's the standard idea. How did he connect it to Yasuke?
He introduced this idea of reverse cultural appropriation. He pointed to the controversy around the Netflix Cleopatra series depicting her as black.
Right, that caused a big backlash in Egypt. People felt it was rewriting their history.
Precisely. So Shikaku's hypothesis was that when a minority group is perceived as taking or altering elements of a majority culture's history, that can also be really contentious, especially in what he called these politically correct card battles online.
Interesting. So how does that apply here? It sounds complicated.
It is. He framed it like this. Soft, being a Western company, gets accused of appropriating Japanese culture. That's the standard direction. But then Yasuke, as a black character, being centered in this Japanese historical setting, is seen by some in Japan as altering their history. So historical revisionism.
So you have appropriation claims going one way and revisionism claims going another way, all tangled up.
Exactly. It's this complex interaction. And Shikaku argued that because of these sensitivities, even if Soft had slapped a giant "this is fiction" label on the game, the controversy probably still would have happened.
Because the underlying issues were already there.
Yeah. He talked about multiple fires fueling the whole thing, including how Soft themselves handled it, which is a whole other dimension.
Right. Okay, so let's move into another big area of debate.
Yeah.
Was Yasuke actually a samurai? And what role did Thomas Lockley's work play here?
This is definitely a huge point of contention. As Lockley's books popularized Yasuke's story, they naturally came under the microscope, especially regarding the samurai question. And those claims about the black slave trade popped up again in this context, too.
Did Shikaku look into Lockley's own words about his research?
He did. He checked out some interviews Lockley gave. On one program, The Black in Japan, Lockley called his Japanese book Nobunaga and Yasuke an academic book. But then on another podcast, New Books Network, he called the Japanese version academic from 2017, but described the English version, African Samurai, as more of a readable version.
Ah, a difference in description.
Yeah, and when asked directly about how much was fiction, he kind of downplayed it, suggesting it was only a little bit. So it seems maybe how he framed the scholarly aspect varied a bit.
Interesting. So Shikaku felt Lockley's claims of academic rigor were questionable.
Debatable, yeah. Shikaku acknowledged the books are based on research, but he pointed out what he saw as big interpretive leaps.
Like jumping to conclusions.
Sort of. And including some factual errors, like apparently misstating the number of firearms in Japan at the time. Shikaku felt the style was closer to maybe an enthusiastic amateur historian than strict, peer-reviewed scholarship.
And Lockley calling himself a university associate professor and history expert in interviews probably adds to the confusion.
Right. And it seems his specific expertise might not even be Japanese history per se. Shikaku also noted how Lockley sometimes presents possibilities as if they're definite facts.
And the co-author of African Samurai is a fiction writer.
Correct. Which might explain some of the narrative style. But it's really important to stress again, while Shikaku was critical of Lockley's interpretive methods, he defended him against that specific black slave trade accusation we talked about earlier.
Okay, so how does Lockley's book actually talk about slavery and Yasu's status then?
Well, the book directly contradicts the idea that the Jesuits supported slavery or that Japan had an active black slave trade. It portrays Yasuke as employed, not enslaved.
Employed, not property.
Right. And it suggests the Japanese were mostly just fascinated by Africans' appearance. So, based purely on what Lockley wrote, that whole slave trade claim seems pretty unfounded.
And the English version wasn't different on this point. Some comments suggested it was more accusatory towards Japan.
According to Shikaku, no. The English version doesn't make that accusation either. In fact, he says it often praises Japan's acceptance of Yasuke, sometimes maybe even exaggerating it.
Exaggerating. How so?
Like comparing the Japanese to white folk in their supposed openness, or even suggesting Yasuke was seen almost like a black Buddha.
A black Buddha? Where does that come from?
Lockley apparently links the Japanese fascination partly to Buddhist art, sometimes depicting Buddhas with darker skin. He also uses accounts of crowds gathering to see Yasuke as evidence he might have been, revered.
Which Shikaku saw as another interpretive leap.
Yeah, that seems to be a pattern Shikaku identified in Lockley's approach, taking a detail and stretching the interpretation quite far.
Okay. And given how sensitive the topic of the black slave trade is, especially in the West.
Exactly. It seems unlikely Lockley would intentionally misrepresent Japan on that specific point in his English book. That whole black slave trade in Japan theory seems to be mostly a debate within Japan, not something widely discussed or accepted in Western academic circles.
So in the West, the criticisms are more about
UBI soft, maybe appropriating Japanese culture, and Lockley perhaps overstating Yasuke's importance or engaging with the culture without full nuance. But often, as Mr. Bushido found, it just spirals into political arguments instead of sticking to the historical facts.
And you mentioned Professor Hirayama getting backlash, too.
Yes, apparently his criticisms specifically about Yasuke's samurai status also stir up a lot of controversy online.
Okay, let's talk about where Yasuke actually came from, his origins. The YouTube discussion covered some possibilities.
It did. Later sources, like from the 17th century after Yasuke's time, often point to Mozambique.
That comes from a French Jesuit writer.
Yes, François Solier, in A History of Japan, he wrote. And his account was repeated by others, like Jean Crasset, mentioning Mozambique and arrival via Goa in India.
But Lockley himself questioned this.
Yeah, Lockley acknowledged Solier's account had geographical inaccuracies. He suggested Solier might have just assumed Mozambique because it was a known Portuguese colony in Africa, and Alessandro Valignano, the Jesuit who likely brought Yasuke, had stopped there.
So it was maybe an educated guess by Solier, not based on direct knowledge.
Possibly. The really key thing is, contemporary sources like the letters of Louis Fra, who was actually in Japan with Yasuke, don't mention Mozambique at all.
Ah, so the best primary sources are silent on that specific origin.
Exactly. Which makes the Mozambique theory less solid. It's possible Yasuke was enslaved somewhere else and then brought to Mozambique, maybe.
What about that theory linking his name to Yasuf in Mozambique?
That seems to trace back to a TV show, World Mysterious Discovery, and it's probably unreliable. Lockley has apparently also suggested South Sudan as a possibility.
So the bottom line is,
we don't really know for sure where Yasuke originally came from. The historical record just isn't clear enough on that point.
that lack of certainty is telling. Okay, let's circle back to the really crucial question. Was he a samurai? And how did Lockley handle that definition? Sounds like it wasn't consistent.
No, it really wasn't. Lockley seems to use the term samurai in different ways. In the afterword of African samurai, he kind of suggests it was just a job title back then, basically, a warrior.
Okay, broad definition.
But elsewhere in that same book, and definitely in his other book, Yasuke, a legendary African warrior, he implies it means something more elite, a privileged warrior class.
A more specific, higher status.
Right. And then, get this, the Japanese translation of his book, Nobunaga and Yasuke, apparently defines samurai as high-ranking warriors serving lords, specifically excluding lower-level soldiers, the ashigaru.
Wow, so that version is quite specific.
And in that same Japanese version, Lockley describes Yasuke not as a commander, but as a kusho.
Kosho. What's that?
Basically a personal attendant or page, someone very close to Nobunaga, yes, but not necessarily a warrior leader in his own right. So it's really ambiguous how Lockley positions Yasuke's actual rank.
So the picture shifts depending on which book or even which part of the book you're looking at. What about his claim Yasuke reached the upper echelon of society?
Yeah, Lockley does claim that. But what upper echelon means is subjective, isn't it? It likely comes from that story about Nobunaga planning to give him a castle.
Right.
And Lockley says Yasuke lived in a castle. But again, that could just mean he had quarters within a castle compound, which is very different from being the lord of the castle.
It paints a much more nuanced, maybe less grand picture than some popular portrayals.
Definitely. I mean, look at the Netflix anime Yasuke. It shows him as this super powerful samurai, but everyone accepts it's fiction.
And it didn't cause the same kind of cultural appropriation storm?
Not really, no. Perhaps because it was made in Japan for a Japanese audience. That might change the dynamic compared to a Western company like UBI, Soft, tackling the story.
And Assassin's Creed aims for more historical realism generally.
Or at least gives that impression, yeah. So people scrutinize the historical accuracy much more closely.
Okay, finally, let's touch on the main historical source often cited, the Shinchoki, the Chronicle of Nobunaga. What does it actually say about Yasuke, and how reliable is that specific part?
Right, so there's a specific version, the 15-volume manuscript held at the Songekaku Bunko Library. That version is the one that mentions Nobunaga giving Yasuke a sword by a famous maker, Niji Kunitoshi, plus a residence and maybe some kind of rank.
Okay, so it's in that specific copy.
Yes. And crucially, that detail isn't found in other, potentially earlier versions of the Shinchuki Kuki. Plus, this Sankekaku manuscript is itself a later copy from the Edo period.
How much later?
Over 100 years after Yasuke's time. So it's not a contemporary account of that specific event.
Which raises questions, obviously.
It does. One historian, Kaneko Hiroaki, suggested this version might just be based on an earlier, more detailed draft that included lots of minor details, like about falconry, that got cut from later, shorter versions.
So maybe it preserves some authentic details lost elsewhere.
That's one possibility, but there are also things in the Sankekaku manuscript itself that look like they might be later additions, put in maybe to make the story clearer or flow better.
Like,
Well, there's an example about the siege of Takamatsu Castle. This version includes extra details about Hideyoshi's actions after the surrender that aren't in other versions. These details clarify the narrative, but they could also be later embellishments.
okay, so if parts were potentially added later for clarity or drama.
Then the passage about Yasuke getting the sword and residence might also be a later addition or interpretation. Its historical authenticity isn't absolutely certain.
So even the primary source has layers of complexity when it comes to these specific details about Yasuke's status.
Exactly. It's a good reminder of how tricky historical reconstruction can be, working with sources that have their own histories.
Wow. Okay, this has been quite the journey through a really tangled controversy.
It really has.
We've covered the intense, sometimes misinformed online reactions, Mr. Bushido trying to correct the record on that slave trade claim, and hitting walls.
Shikaku's framework of cultural appropriation and historical revisionism adding that other dimension.
The whole debate over Yasuke's samurai status, the inconsistencies in Lockley's work, the uncertainty about his origins.
And finally, digging into the primary source, the Shinchuki, and seeing the questions even around that.
Yeah. What really comes through is that there's still a lot of debate, a lot we don't know for sure about Yasuke's life and his exact position.
Definitely. And it's so important, especially with online discussions, to try and separate the historical evidence from fictional accounts or interpretations being pushed as fact.
So for you, the learner, listening in, as you come across this stuff online or elsewhere, maybe keep these different perspectives in mind. Approach it critically.
Yeah, question the assumptions, look for the evidence, think about the different cultural viewpoints and potential biases involved.
It leaves us with something to think about, doesn't it?
For sure.
Given this whole mix, the history, the interpretation, the fiction, what does Yasuke's story really tell us today? About how we understand the past, about representation, about cultural exchange.
And maybe what responsibility do creators, commentators, all of us really have when we tell stories about history? How do we balance engagement with accuracy and respect?
Lots to ponder there. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
We hope it brought some clarity, maybe sparked a few of those aha moments for you.